Hello gaming friends, DM Samuel here. Today I'm going to talk you through the first chapter of this massive book. It is the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Core Rulebook, and it clocks in at a humongous 640 pages. But it's entirely understandable. This is a game that has all of the same fantasy game tropes that you are used to if you've played any other RPG that's fantasy-based and class-based, such as Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, or any previous edition, or something like Swords and Wizardry, or Castles and Crusades, or any other RPG. It has all of those tropes with a few little tweaks, and we're going to talk about those now. First, I want to talk to you about this amazing cover art. Look at this cover art. There's a full shot up above, okay? But here I'm going to sort of scroll through my PDF version of this book. I have a hard copy, and it's humongous, so I'm going to use the PDF version because it's easy to display to you as I scroll through. Look at this amazing art. Here is a wonderful red dragon. I believe this cover art is by Wayne Reynolds, and here we have some of the iconic Pathfinder PCs, or the characters, okay? This is the ranger, this is the cleric, this is the thief, rogue, okay? And you can see that there are claw marks on the walls here. There's a small totem or pillar that's been knocked over. There's a lot of damage coming in here, and this dragon is just impinging on the scene. It's amazing. Of course, Pathfinder has this wonderful art. Pathfinder's known for all of its excellent art, okay? And if we look at this core rulebook real quick, something new. In first edition, they never put the name on the core rulebook. Here they did. This book was written and designed and mathed out by Logan Bonner, Jason Bowman, Stephen Radney McFarland, and Mark Seifter. So, let's talk about what is in here. Again, this book clocks in at a huge, hefty, around 640 pages, but look, the glossary index is the last several pages of that, and that's because it has this amazing, awesome glossary and index combined. It's not two things, it's one thing. But let's move on. I want to actually go through Chapter 1 with you today, and I want to try to make this a video that's not too extremely long, because there are some chapters that are going to be long. So this series is going to be quite a hefty undertaking, but let's go ahead and get to it. The next thing that you see is this sort of two-page spread. On the left-hand side of the spread, you see some more iconics. They are fighting some kobolds. You can see the new kobold look in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And on the other side is this huge bug-like creature coming through, which is Pathfinder's version of an Ankh-Egg, probably, which I can't remember the name of at the moment, but we'll get there because I'm going to talk about the beastry too eventually. And so here we go. Here we are. The first chapter starts with a little narrative sort of vignette that talks about our more iconics here. That's one thing that Pathfinder does a little bit better than D&D. It has these iconic characters that people know the names of, that they've used throughout the entire run of Pathfinder 1, and they've just brought them right into Pathfinder 2nd Edition so that everyone gets this element of familiarity. And they're here in this scene. Again, really awesome art, and it's showing us a battle that was occurring with a bunch of undead, probably referencing the Whispering Tyrant Tar-Baphon, who is a big player in the setting Golarion, which is where this game is based. Of course, just like any other fantasy game, you can actually use this in your homebrew setting or any other setting, okay? So let's talk about Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is a wonderful, wonderful introduction to the game. And what you're going to see here is everywhere in this book, on the right-hand side, there is this sort of small, shortened, abbreviated table of contents that tells you exactly where you are in the book. You see introduction is highlighted. That's showing you where you are. And as we go down, you're going to see that the different areas are going to be highlighted with this red background. It also tells us where we are at the top of every page, up here in a red banner, and down at the bottom, of course, is a page number. Now, that doesn't seem like all that big of a deal, but I just want to point out that this, and also, of course, if you're on the left-hand side, you'll see the banners and whatnot on the left, okay, if you're on the other side of the page. So here's the thing. Why does that make a difference? Because in such a huge book, a 640-page book, this thing is like a textbook. It needs to be very easily accessible as a reference. And I think they've worked really hard to try to make that the case. We'll see if they're really successful, but I think that at least they have a good start. So we start with the general, what is a role-playing game? I'm not sure that anybody that's listening to this or watching this video cast is wondering what a role-playing game is. You probably already know that everybody at the table takes on some sort of persona. If you're the GM, you might take on the persona of all the different individuals in the setting. And if you're a player, then you're going to take on usually one, maybe sometimes two, or even more different player characters or PCs. You're going to use dice to try to see if you have succeeded at a task. Okay, that's the very basics of it. And that's really all it's going to talk about in here. It defines player character for us, it defines non-player character, it defines monsters, it defines experience points, all of the sort of general things that you would expect in a fantasy RPG, very much on the model of D&D, Dungeons & Dragons. Instead of races, we have ancestries, we have backgrounds, we have ability modifiers, we have feats, we have skills. All that stuff gets introduced right here in the most basic of terms. Okay, and then it talks a little bit about creating a narrative and how you want to make sure that you are creating a story that is fun to play, and you might just be playing in one adventure, or you might be playing in an entire campaign. It now introduces some differences between Pathfinder 2nd Edition and some of the early D&D or early elements of fantasy role-playing games, in that this game is going to split things into three types of gameplay modes: the exploration mode, the encounter mode, and the downtime mode. And really all it's trying to tell you is that there are different types of appropriate behavior or expected behaviors for these different types of gameplay elements. In encounter mode, that's when you get combat, and that's what a lot of the rules are around, because of course that is one of the most complicated parts of the game. On the other hand, exploration is what you're doing while you're in game time and you're not in a fight. So you might be looking for secret doors, you might be searching for traps, you might be searching around an abandoned tomb, or you might be walking around a castle looking for a hidden alcove, or trying to find someone that you're supposed to be meeting with secretly to find out more information about the king's new advisor. Any of those things, that would be exploration mode. You're not directly in a fight, you might be in a social situation. That social situation might turn into an encounter, but it probably started out as exploration. Downtime is when you are not actively adventuring. You might be spending time at home healing up. You might be talking to people in your hometown. You might be crafting something or trying to learn a new skill. All of those sorts of things, that would be downtime. Not something that you're necessarily playing out in long form at the table, but you're making sure that can happen so that the characters can grow and change themselves. Okay, then we are going to explain here how we are going to determine if a task is successful or not based on a difficulty class, and you're going to roll a 20-sided die, and you are going to either succeed or fail, or you might possibly critically succeed, that is a really super duper success, or you might possibly critically fail, and that is based on the number you roll, you add your modifier, and then compare that to the difficulty class, and that's going to tell you how well you succeeded or how poorly you failed. Also, proficiency in this game exists, but it's a little bit different than what you might get if you're used to 5th edition. In 5th edition D&D, proficiency for all characters is the same. If they are proficient in something, they have the same proficiency bonus for all of those tasks based on level, and because in 5th edition everyone levels up at the same time, that means everyone is at the same basic proficiency. Well, here, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, you can have 5 different levels of proficiency in a particular skill or the use of a particular item, like a weapon or armor. If you are untrained, you get no bonuses whatsoever to that particular item. You might still be able to attempt it, in many cases you will be, but you're not going to get any kind of bonuses. And because you don't have any kind of bonuses, even if you level up, you do not add your level, so you're not going to get better at that item if you are completely untrained. You'll just stay a baseline, poorly able to complete that successfully. If you're trained, you get 2 plus your level as your bonus for that item anytime you attempt something related to that. If you are an expert, that's the next level, you get a +4 plus your level. And because you add your level to those, that means that as you level up, you get better at the things you're already good at. Master is the next level, you get a +6 plus your level, and Legendary is the uppermost level, you get +8 plus your level. So if you're legendary at using a longsword, that means that you get, anytime you use that longsword, you get an 8 plus your level, plus your ability modifier related to that particular element. And in this case, if it's a longsword, it's probably an attack. So, in other words, Legendary is much better than Master, better than Expert, better than Trained, and all of those are much, much better than Untrained. And if you're untrained, as you go up in level, you do not progress. But if you are trained, even at the lowest level of trained, you still get your level advantage. So you actually get better at those things as you level up. So that's something I took a little time to explain it because I want you to understand that's one of those elements that's a little bit different. Even though the word used, proficiency, is the same, it's a little bit different in 5th edition than it is Pathfinder 2nd edition. Now, this video isn't specifically to highlight differences between 5th edition and 2nd edition. This video is really just to highlight 2nd edition, but because I know that many of you watching might actually be coming from experience with 5th edition D&D and only experience with 5th edition D&D, I just want to point out that even though some of the words used are the same, there might be slightly different meanings or slightly different ways to calculate those particular mathematical elements of the character. The book moves on to explain about exploration and encounters. We have some more cool art with Lim here. He's the iconic bard character. Then it talks about armor class and free actions and reactions and saving throws and all of those things. And it also brings up something that is called the strike action. The strike action is what you do when you're attacking. So if you're an encounter and you're attacking something, you're using a strike action. And in this game, it has a different action economy than what you have with 5th edition D&D. It has 3 actions that you can perform, and you can do anything you want within those 3 actions. However, there are some stipulations on those actions. Yes, you can attack 3 times. However, if you attack more than once in a particular round, you will take an attack penalty, and that is down here highlighted, and it's called the multiple attack penalty, or MAPS. If you go looking on Reddit or some other videos and other different social media platforms, you'll see people talking about Pathfinder 2 and the map. The map isn't a picture of where you are or a map of the dungeon. It's the multiple attack penalty. Now, of course, depending on context, they might be talking about a map. But anyway, so when you're in combat, people are going to strike, they're going to attack, and if they attack more than once in a turn, which they can do, everyone can do, no problem, except you take a penalty. And that's because it's hard to attack more than once in a 6-second combat round. Okay, so it defines these things for you. Our saving throws here in Pathfinder 2nd edition, you have a fortitude save, you have a reflex save, and you have a will save. It's going to talk about all of those. Again, this chapter is just the introductory chapter. It's trying to point out some similarities and differences between games that you may have heard of or played and this game. Now, this is a much more crunchy game. It has many more rules and many more rules exceptions than 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And so you are going to run into a case where terms mean very specific things. Now, that's also true actually in 5th edition. Terms mean very specific things. But in Pathfinder 2nd edition, sometimes those terms are used as traits or are used to indicate that you're calling on certain rules elements. And in that case, it matters how you actually interpret those elements. And so this chapter goes a long way in giving you some definitions of key terms that you will use and you will talk about and you'll learn about in further chapters. And this is really important because, again, this game is much more crunchy than 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. That is, it has many more rules. There's a lot more minutia. Now, some of us thrive on that. Some of us find it really, really interesting and really wonderful. And some people don't, and that's okay. I find it really fun. It makes me reminisce about my 3rd edition and 4th edition D&D days, and I really, really enjoy how all the elements of the minutia here, of those little crunchy rules bits, have been put together in Pathfinder 2e. And I hope you do too. And if you're If you're PF2 curious, then here we are. If we keep going here, you see there's a couple of pages of definitions here. If you don't understand any of these elements, it's okay. You can always just go to the glossary and index in the back, and it will tell you exactly what pages you can find those on, or you can come back to this section and read a very brief definition, and then it will tell you what chapter you can find more information about that in. It really is meant to be an introductory chapter. And then we are following that up with the sort of proverbial example of play. And in this example of play, it's kind of a very generic, simplistic example of play, but that's the whole point of it. It's meant to give you an idea of how play will flow and exactly what's going on. And in this basic example, it points out a couple of different things that might be important. It shows you how they determined their initiative, for example. It shows you how the GM rolls certain roles and the player did not roll certain roles. It tells you how the GM and the players will interact in a typical game. And so you get about 3 pages of that. And then we have a section on how to use the book. And here it's just going to describe to you exactly how to go through and what you should expect to find in each chapter. Now, this is a pretty boring chapter. I mean, it's just the introduction. It's just really trying to give you an idea of what you're going to see in this book. And I think it does a good job of that, even if it doesn't tell you everything that you need to know. But what it is going to do is going to tell you the most important things. And this page right here is the first page where we really get to something extremely important. So I'm going to slow down and I'm going to talk about this real quick and go through this piece by piece so that you can understand, because this is one of the most important elements in the Pathfinder 2 game, and that is actions. I mentioned earlier that on their turn, if you're in an encounter, on your turn, each PC gets 3 actions. Now, it turns out that not every single thing that you do only costs 1 action. Sometimes things cost 2 actions. And that is then called a 2-action activity, and it is denoted by this symbol up here. Sometimes things cost 3 actions, and that would be called a 3-action activity, and that is denoted by this symbol here. So you can see, not donated, denoted. So you can see this area here. It's showing you a sort of square with a line cut out, right? A little chevron cut out. And here it's showing you that square, and then there's an extra one on top of it. That's how you know that's 2. And here it's showing you the initial square, and then there is an extra one and a third one there, and that's how you know it's a 3-action activity. And now this reaction, this is something that you do not specifically on your turn. You do this activity on someone else's turn. In other words, they do something that causes you to be able to react. And sometimes you're going to want to do actions that are considered free actions. That is, they do not even count against your any individual action. And in that case, they use the same signifier here, the same symbol, except this first notch is darkened out. It's reverse. Here it's black with a light band cut out, and here it's light with a dark band put on it. So it's basically the reverse. It's the negative image of the single action. Okay? Now, you may think to yourself, oh man, how am I going to remember all this? But they use this same symbology throughout every book that they have published for Pathfinder 2 so far, and there have been quite a few already. And you get used to it. It's actually very basic. And in fact, it's extremely helpful because as you start looking at different feats or different ancestry abilities, you can tell at a glance how much it's going to cost you in terms of your action economy to actually perform that particular movement or ability. Okay, and so this is extremely important. Again, some things have a penalty if you do the same thing over and over again, like the multiple attack penalty. And some things just automatically cost 2 actions. So, for example, casting a spell is often a 2-action activity, but not always. Sometimes there are spells that only cost 1 action, but if you choose to spend 2 actions on them, it actually changes and enhances a little bit what the spell does. And if you spend 3 actions on that same spell, it actually enhances it again and does something slightly different and a little bit more powerful. In fact, that's one of the really cool things about this action economy. Because each action is basically worth the same amount, you can change spells and certain activities and make it so that if you perform that action in a slightly different way, it now costs you more than one action, but it does something much bigger. Okay, the heal spell is a wonderful example of that. Let's actually look at the heal spell real quick. The heal spell is on page 343. That is, it's deep into the book. But let's go ahead and increase the font here a little bit so that you can see exactly what this heal spell is doing. Let's take a look at this. Here's the name of the spell. It's heal. It is a first level spell. It has the traits healing, necromancy. Now might make you think an odd thing, but necromancy applies to any sort of healing clerical magic, okay? Because it's doing something to the living flesh. It's also positive versus negative. The two traditions that can cast this type of spell or that are related to this type of spell are Divine and Primal. In Pathfinder 2, there are 4 spell traditions. There's Arcane and Divine, which are the two that you're probably familiar with if you've played 5th edition D&D. There's also Primal and Occult, and we'll deal with those in a little bit later. In this case, it costs 1 action to cast, or 2, or 3. In fact, it says 1 to 3 actions. And what's the range? Well, it varies because it depends on how many actions you choose to spend. And it targets 1 willing living creature or 1 undead, because a healing power that has the positive trait can actually do damage to undead. So here's what it says. It says you channel positive energy to heal the living or damage the undead. If the target is a willing living creature, you restore 1d8 hit points. If the target is undead, you deal that amount of damage to it, and it's got the positive trait. If the target is undead, it takes damage because you're dealing healing to it. Anyway, the number of actions that you spend when you cast this spell determines what the range is, how far out the area that this applies, and some other parameters. So let's actually talk about that. If you use 1 action to cast this spell, it uses a somatic component. Somatic being a movement component. Verbal would be verbal, okay, and material would be an actual piece of other material. So this has a somatic component because you have to touch the creature that you're casting the spell on. And so it will heal you 1d8. If, however, you spend 2 actions on it, now it has a somatic component and a verbal component. The spell now has a range of 30 feet, so the somatic component isn't touching the creature that you're healing anymore. It is actually waving around and doing some sort of correct, appropriate movement to cause the energy of the spell to emanate out from you, along with a verbal component where you are speaking the magical divine words. And now the spell has a range of 30 feet, and if you are healing a living creature, you increase the hit points restored by 8. Not 1d8, you don't roll. It's now doing 1d8 plus 8 hit points of healing. Okay? Still 1 target. If you spend 3 actions to cast this same spell, still a level 1 spell, still a level 1 spell slot, then you disperse positive energy in a 30-foot emanation. It emanates out from you in 30 feet. And it targets all living and undead creatures. And it will now heal all the creatures 1d8 hit points, all of your allies 1d8 hit points. So in other words, the same spell can have different actions, different effects based on the number of action, the amount of energy you put into it. Okay? We'll talk about what happens when you heighten a spell when we get to the spell chapters. So let's go back to the page we were on before, which was about the action economy. And so you get the idea that this is actually very flexible because you can take those spells. Now, I will tell you personally, I feel like I wish they would have done what they did with the heal spell a little more with arcane spells. There aren't as many arcane spells that actually, when you change the number of actions, it changes sort of the essence of the spell and how it works. But perhaps we'll see more of that as time goes on. As we move through here, we now get to the point in this chapter where it's trying to tell you and teach you how to read the rules. And I kind of went through this with you just a moment ago because I read you the heal spell. And so now it's telling you how to actually do that for yourself. You have your name here. It tells you the action type. It tells you the level. It gives you some traits. And then it tells you different elements about that. Now, I'm not going to read this all to you because I kind of did that with the heal spell. I did that on purpose so that you could see exactly how easy that is. This makes it sound way more complicated than it is. It's actually very easy because every feat or action uses the same format, and so you get used to it because it is very well formatted, and it makes sense. As we move on, it's now going to walk us through character creation. Character creation is very important because this is the point where the player gets to choose exactly how they're going to create the persona that they're going to play in the game. And it has a lot of steps, 19 or so steps. There's a lot of steps, okay? But don't get me wrong, 19 steps, but each of them are points where you're making choices that matter to your character. These things all matter. And they're going to build up your character so that when you walk into that first session with your PC, you have the type of character that is exactly what you want, and you can envision what they can do in future levels. And unlike Pathfinder 1 and D&D 3 and 3.5, you don't have to really worry about a ton of trap feats or making a suboptimal character, because there are so many built-in things here that you just get that aren't traps and aren't weak. In fact, Pathfinder 2 is a very well-balanced game, and pretty much all the choices you could make are not going to be a problem. And even if you did make a slightly suboptimal character because you were going for a particular theme or a particular type of role-playing style, that's not going to hurt anything. It's not going to hurt anything. It doesn't rely on system mastery for you to be able to make a really good, really, really effective character. Okay, so don't worry about there being 19 steps. It's going to be fun as you go through and you make your character. Okay, so presuming you start at level 1, how do you determine your ability scores? Well, again, we have the same 6 ability scores, the same 6 attributes that you have in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And so strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. They all start out at 10. They start with 10. And you're going to choose an ancestry, which is called a race in D&D 5th edition. It's called ancestry in Pathfinder 2. That ancestry is going to tell you certain things about your character, okay? It's going to tell you, for example, your size, your speed. It's going to give you some boosts to those attributes that only started at a 10, okay? Then you're going to choose a background. So here are the ancestries that are in the core book. We have dwarf, elf, gnome, goblin, halfling, and human. You can see that it gives a very, very short, concise description of these, has some nice art that goes with it. It tells you which abilities are going to be boosted if you choose that ancestry, and it tells you which one has a flaw. So it turns out that choosing your ancestry gives you a boost to 2 or more different abilities, and it also might cause you to actually remove some points from one of your abilities. And then you're going to choose a background, and then you're going to choose a class. Your background will also give you stat boosts, okay, and some skill training and a lore skill and a feat based on your background, and also then you're going to choose your class. And the 12 classes, there are 12 classes in the core rulebook. They are Alchemist, Barbarian, Bard, and Champion. Champion is the new name for a Paladin. So if you play 5th edition D&D and you're used to Paladins, that's called a Champion in this game. They each have a key ability score, okay? And they each have secondary ability scores that if you make sure those are the higher ability scores at the end of character creation, that because remember, you're getting boosts and flaws based on your choices. So this is trying to tell you at a glance where you should be putting your boosts and where you should put any secondary boosts. And that way, if there is a flaw, you can actually deal with that and make sure that your flaw doesn't affect any of your secondary ability scores. 4 more classes, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, and Monk. You can see, again, very short, concise description and a key ability score. Next, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, and Wizard. Key abilities, secondary ability scores. You get the idea. It's trying to lay it out for you very shortly, very sweetly, okay? But not a huge amount of detail. Now, that detail does show up, right? It comes in a later chapter. Okay, here it's just the introduction. It's just trying to show you what you are going to get into as you're starting to make decisions later on. By the time you've chosen your ancestry, your background, and your class, you're going to then have some more ability boosts that you can add to your character, and you cannot have any stat over 18, and you cannot have any stat below 8. Okay, and so then you're going to determine your final ability modifiers based on all of your choices, and I passed up the table here earlier, but here is the table. It's a very sort of standard table. If you have an attribute between 8 and 9, you have a -1. If you have between 10 and 11, it's a 0 modifier. 12 and 13 is a +1, 14, 15 is +2, 16, 17 is +3, and 18, 19 is +4. Now, because at the start of character creation, at the start of level 1, you will only have a possibility of having 18 and no higher, +4 is going to be the highest possible modifier that you can have at the beginning of the game, and because nothing should be less than 8, -1 could be the lowest possible negative modifier that you have at the beginning of the game. So you're going to determine those ability modifiers, and then you're going to determine your hit points. And your hit points basically comes from your class and your ancestry. And of course, in this chapter, it has this relatively confusing image. It splits these down into 10 steps, and it tries to point to the places where you're going to apply those steps. But because certain areas of the character sheet have more than one step, for example, up here where there's 4, and here where there's 3 and then 2, you know, it gets a little confusing. Plus, one of the biggest complaints that people had about this character sheet when this book was released is, who chose brown? That is super ugly. I actually don't mind the brown so much. I do think this sheet is very busy. And so I suggest you either use the online Path Builder or you use Hero Lab Online, and then it will format your sheet as you're going through and making your character. On the other hand, though, for your first character, and I suggest this for every game, including crunchy ones and including light ones, for your first character, you should build this on paper. Don't worry about the character sheet, just write it out on paper as you're making your choices, as you're going through. Still follow these steps, sure, but don't worry about filling out the PC sheet, the actual official PC sheet, right? I'm sure if you go looking online, you'll see a whole bunch of different PC sheets that aren't quite as overwhelming as this one, and that's wonderful, but do your first character by hand, writing it on the page, because that's how you learn how the flow of that character creation occurs. And in fact, I suggest before you ever even do anything, make 3 characters. 2 of them should be the same class, and 1 of them should be different, just so that you get an idea of how you could make 2 individuals of the same class very different, and then have a third individual, a completely different class, and you could see those similarities and differences. Plus, it gets you used to where your different bonuses and penalties come from. And that's extremely important, because as a player, when you sit down to play, even if you've never played before, the GM will be helped by you knowing a little bit about how your character works, even if it's the smallest modicum, the tiniest sliver of knowledge. The more knowledge you bring to the table about your own character, regardless of anything else, you don't have to know anything else. The more you know about your character, the better. Okay? Now, a couple other things. Your starting proficiencies are given to you by your class, and in some cases by background, and then you're going to make all the different choices that you need to make. If you're playing a spellcaster, you're going to have to make spell choices, and then you're going to take your starting money, which is 15 gold or 150 silver pieces, and that sounds like not very much, except Pathfinder 2 uses a silver standard, so 150 silver pieces is a pretty good amount of money for you to purchase starting equipment. You're then going to calculate some things like your perception and your saving throws and your ranged attack bonuses and how much damage you do with the certain piece of equipment that you bought, and you're going to choose a deity probably, and you're going to figure out what age you are based on your ancestry and how much experience you have, and all of those things. You're going to determine the numerical things, the Pathfinder parts of the game, like your AC and your class DC, and how much your encumbrance, how much you're carrying. They use what's called the bulk system here in Pathfinder 2, and that is a system where It's relatively easy to calculate because each item has a bulk rating, not just based on weight, so you're not doing minute little weight additions when you pick up an arrow, for example, but it's based on not just weight, but size. And so you have a sort of generic, sort of abstracted bulk rating, and each character can carry 5 plus your strength modifier. That amount of things, that amount of bulk. And some things don't have a bulk rating, and it takes 10 of those to just make one bulk rating. So you can imagine that even if you are fairly strong, you can carry a lot of stuff, but even if you're fairly weak, you might be able to carry a lot of stuff. It depends on what you're trying to carry. Of course, if you've got on plate mail armor and a giant tower shield, and you're very weak, you've only got a strength of 10, you're probably not going to be able to carry very much else. But if you're a big, lofty fighter, and you've got an 18 strength, okay, your modifier's +4, and that means you can carry a bulk of 9 and just be barely encumbered. If you carry a bulk of 8, you're not encumbered at all. Okay, now we'll talk again about that in the equipment chapter as we go through, but just to give you an idea. And so if we move on here, you'll see it tries to give you a second page here where it explains how you should be filling these things out all throughout character creation. Again, they split it into 10 steps. I personally split it into 19 steps because I break things down a little bit further. For example, step 9 has you calculate saving throws, your perception value, and your melee attacks and ranged attacks. I split those out and I make perception 1 step and saving throws 1 step, and melee strikes and ranged strikes a different step. So that's how come that happens like that. And then you get to your step 10, which is alignment and gender and figuring out some hero points and your armor class. All those things I split out. That's why I have 19 steps and the book only has 10 steps. And lastly, what this book does, which is really great, is it gives you an example of a person going through character creation for the first time. And it spells everything out, and it says what choices are made and how that affected the PC, and it goes through each step the way that they've spelled it out, and it allows you, if you wanted to follow this exactly, you could actually create this character on paper as you went. And then it talks about, right at the end there, this is kind of in a weird spot because now it means that every time you level up, you're going to have to go back to way back to chapter 1. But here's basically what they do. They say, okay, here's what you would do to make a level 1 character. Here's a great example of it. But if you wanted to level up that character, or when you're ready to level up your character in your game, here's your checklist. Here's everything that you have to do. And so it goes through those, how you determine the XP that you need, how the hit points change, where the class features are coming in, and all of that sort of thing. And then that is the end of the first chapter, and this big piece of art here is to signify that we're getting into chapter 2. So I'm going to stop right there. I plan to do every chapter. So I hope that this was a little bit helpful to you. I hope that it's not extremely boring. Chapter 1 is probably maybe the worst chapter to start with in some cases because it really is just an overview. But it does give you an idea of some of the things that make Pathfinder different. Now, it doesn't give you an idea of all of them because it doesn't actually show you or give you any indication about how teamwork-oriented Pathfinder 2 ends up being. It doesn't give you an indication of how balanced Pathfinder 2 ends up being. It doesn't give you an indication of how fun it is to play with the 3-action economy. And it doesn't tell you very much about the critical success system, that is the critical system, because it only tells you that there are 4 levels of success or failure. There's critical failure, success, and critical success, but it doesn't tell you how to determine those, and it doesn't tell you the secret that is, in some cases, it can be a skill check that you critically succeed on, and that might have a separate effect. Or it could be a save that you critically succeed on, and that has a different effect than just a regular save. And how do you get a critical anyway? It's not just a d20 roll. In fact, to get a critical success in Pathfinder 2, you simply have to make a roll, plus add your modifiers, and if the result is 10 or more than the DC that you were trying to beat, it's a critical success. You don't have to roll a 20. There's more than a 5% chance that you could critically succeed on something in many, many situations. So it makes for a very interesting, very, very interesting game, because it's also not just combat. And this chapter doesn't really tell you any of that. It just tells you, oh, there's a weird system with 4 layers. It's brilliant. Mark Seifter developed that system. He pitched it, they play tested it, and it ended up in the game because it is awesome. And so I'm going to leave you with that. Next time, we're going to talk about ancestries and backgrounds, and we'll go through all the nitty-gritties of those, what makes some of them cool, what makes some of them sound mediocre, but how do you grow into being more dwarfy or more elfy as you grow in level? When do you get new feats? When do you get new abilities? We're going to talk about all that in the next episode. So thank you for watching if you've lasted this whole time, and I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your eyeballs, and so I will talk to you later.